Hey designers, welcome back to the studio. In the last tutorial, we kind of got going with a bit of an introduction. We made one of the first tools, the abrasive saw, that you're going to need to kind of make this tutorial happen. If you didn't make your abrasive saw, go back and watch the last little bit of that tutorial. You're going to need this thing, possibly even by the end of this tutorial. But today we're going to get into sort of the planning phase, a bit of the drawing, and some of the cutting, initial cutting of the ribs for fabricating your rib and stringer form. Now, we're limited by a couple of things with this design. We're limited by the amount of wood you have. We're limited by the sort of number of stringers that you'll have. But let's actually do some drawings to figure out where these limits actually are. Get yourself a clean space to work and some paper. Now I recommend just sort of using your sketchbook for this because we're going to end up probably blowing through a few different pages. We're also going to need your sticks here. We're going to end up cutting them down to length so we can see what we're doing. And we're going to be producing a series of drawings that sort of not only get the feel for what you might want to construct, but also teach us a little bit about what the sort of limits of our materials are and how much, and sort of how large our ribs will have to be. In order to have any idea about that at all, let's actually get our wood strips cut down. Remember, the wood strips we're using are the thinner strips that you have in your kit. So if you have some left over from our previous projects, make sure that you're using all the same kind, first of all. Now, no matter what dimension your smaller sticks are, whether they're the sort of flatter versions or whether they actually have a square orientation, they're the 16th by 16th, it doesn't really matter as long as you are using the 4 that you have in your kit here. And what we're going to do with these 4 is, since these are 24-inch long pieces, they're kind of difficult to travel back and forth to school, and we're not going to be able to make a 24-inch long piece that would only be 4 stringers, right? We're going to divide these into thirds. So get a nice sharp X-Acto blade. Use the measurements on your cutting mat to break these things down into 3 8-inch segments. These don't have to be super precise cuts at this point because the end of the stringers are going to be refined quite a bit later on. So even kind of a partial cut and a snap is just fine for these ones. So now, if you've kind of got these all down to the 8-inch strips, these will travel much easier, and it gives you sort of a sense of how much wood you have to work with. What we're going to do is grab one of those strips, and I want you just to sort of flex that gently in your fingers and get a sense for what the wood is capable of. What can this wood sort of what direction does it want to bend? Since mine are milled in a slightly different orientation, they are sort of milled to be flatter or smaller in one dimension. They like to bend in that dimension, so I can actually get away with a little bit of a bend in this way, but if I try to flex it the other way, it sort of resists my bend. Now, there's also the sort of growth of the wood fibers to consider. Wood generally grows in a way where it will like to bend one direction more than the other. So what you'll end up doing is sort of discovering which direction your wood strips want to bend, and we're not going to fight that. If you start to fight the sort of natural orientation of the wood to bend in a certain direction, it'll just snap on you. So we'll kind of carefully bend this out, and what I want you to do is hold it on a piece of sketchbook paper, and I want you to sort of get a sense for what these strips can do. And one way to sort of record this would be to use a pencil and just run it along the outer edge of that curve. And this starts to give you a sense of maybe what sort of forms your wood is capable of. If I were going to sort of use something in this orientation, this starts to feel a little bit like maybe earlier in the previous video I talked a little bit about the sort of boat shape. This would be almost more like a dory. If this was symmetrical, it would be almost more like a canoe shape. But what I want you to start mapping out would be what's possible with your 8-inch strips. I want you to imagine that wherever there would be a high spot, that would be a place for a rib to be located, And then usually at these end points we have a terminating rib. In a form like this that's just bowed in the middle and tapered at the edges, that would be a fairly simplistic form to do in only 3 ribs. If you've got a form that maybe has a bit more of a complex curve in it, something that is sort of more like a wave, you'll end up with more ribs that kind of stand up in this sort of tall area and then pinch and bend in the others. That would be at least a minimum of 3 ribs. Now there is maybe the illusion that like more ribs would be better. In this case, actually, I think the fewer the ribs that you have in your form, the more gentle your curves will tend to be. But the fewer the ribs you have, the more simplistic your curves are. Now we're still sort of talking about only one dimension of this, right? If I was going to take one of these ribs and actually start to carve it out of the board here, I know what my overall sort of height would have to be here to here, but what I don't know is then as I kind of turn my form to the end, I don't know what its other orientation might be. This seems to have sort of a barrel shape to it, so I could go with a form that is somewhat circular. I could flatten out one edge. I could bring that to a point. Or what might be sort of interesting is if I include more ribs in here, I could introduce a gradual change over the course of that form, a lateral wave as well as sort of a horizontal wave. This was a project that we did in a previous assignment that sort of addresses a similar dilemma, right? You had to consider distorting this form, which is all sanded and laminated foam core, in 2 dimensions. So you can kind of see I have a bit of an hourglass form going in this direction and sort of a partial rotation, a quarter turn, and I've got another hourglass form going this direction. 2 different distortions, and then on this dimension, looking straight down, right, it expands and contracts the same way. So as I'm thinking about designing this 3D form, the more dimensions you consider as you're designing your ribs, the more undulating your forms will be. There's no real problem with keeping it simple, but what I want you to kind of work out in your initial sketches today is what are the possibilities. Now I'm deciding that I am going to sort of stick to the roots of this project and consider it within the context of the sort of boat building or the boat craft that inspired me to kind of think in this ribs and stringer way. And I'm going to do a sort of traditional dory or canoe form. So from one dimension, I'll be looking down on my form and it will kind of belly out symmetrically side to side. And then I'm going to also consider tapering my ribs. In the widest point, the belly rib is going to sort of flatten out and have sort of a flat base. And then coming toward the ends, it's going to not only taper from the sides, but it's going to get shorter. And so it will change its shape and get shorter on either end. So thinking of this form from the top down will give me this view. Thinking of this form looking at it from the side, and it will have what's called a bit of a camber, right? It will kind of dip down at either end. I'm not designing a canoe, I'm just sort of referencing the form of the canoe. Now some of these ideas can come directly from the movement of the sticks. Now some of these ideas could come directly from a reference that you have, or maybe some inspiration you had looking at this. I'm really kind of curious to see what you guys come up with for this design. From here, though, what we need to do is start working with the foam core and kind of begin shaping our initial ribs and fitting them to our templates. Remember, we're totally limited by the length of our 8-inch ribs, and so at some point, whether you do it in sketch or sort of to a scale mock-up here, you're going to have to kind of make a scaled version of your side-to-side so that you know pretty accurately what size your ribs will be. The foam core that you guys have is pre-cut down to about a 10 by 10 inch sheet. That should be plenty for doing what we're doing. But in case you guys run out, I have lots of small scraps left over from previous projects, and so we can just sort of cut up bits and pieces here at school. What I'm going to do first is begin to mark off the sort of overall width of my center rib, and I'm going to use graphite. It's a little bit tricky. It may not show up in the video so clearly, but graphite shows up really well on both light surfaces and dark surfaces because of how highly reflective it is. So I recommend using a nice soft pencil. And then I'm going to try to draw out that sort of large, sort of flattened rib for the middle section here. I'm not going to use a straight edge. I'm going to kind of use the curving nature of maybe the movement of my wrist, maybe the movement of my elbow, because these forms are going to be organic. You want to kind of keep that movement organic. So when you're doing your drawings, you might find it really nice to stand up and kind of keep those drawings moving smoothly. Once I have the rough design cut into or drawn onto the center rib, the best thing to do would be just sort of to rough out a cut of it. Now what we're going to do is use the sort of freehand cutting of an X-Acto blade to do the vast majority of our cutting. To make this happen, you're going to need to make sure you have a nice sharp blade, a nice fresh blade in your X-Acto. It's also going to be really important to remember that the foam core is actually 3 layers of material. You cut through 1 layer at a time in order to keep the cuts smooth and keep your blades fresh. So with 2 or 3 passes, I'm able to kind of quickly work through the thickness of this material. I'm already noticing that my blade is a little bit dull, so I'm going to go ahead and swap that blade out. You guys have a couple of spare blades in your sketchbook, or I have replacement blades at school. Now what we're going to do in order to get closer and closer and closer to our design here is what's called hogging off the waist. And so I'm just going to make some kind of big cuts off to the side here that aren't even close to my initial line. And as I get closer and closer to my graphite line, I'm going to move slower and slower. And remember, you can always cut through 1 layer at a time. You don't need to kind of superhero your way through this material. Okay, so I've sort of gradually roughed that in. Now I'm at a point where even though I have, fairly accurately cut these shapes out, I want to round that edge over. It doesn't quite look right. It's a little lumpy and a little strange. Now is when we'll actually get to use some of that 120 sandpaper. I have a thin strip of my 120 sandpaper cut off here, and what I'm going to do is lay it on a flat surface and just sort of use the kind of rolling action of my wrist to rough down those edges. Now that's getting pretty close to where I want it to be, and I'm noticing I've got a bit of a paper fringe, or what's maybe called a bead, around the outer edge. That paper bead should be able to kind of come off pretty easily. I could use the 120 to just sort of rough that off, and it should peel right off. Or if it feels like the 120 is too aggressive, go ahead and grab your sanding stick, and the sanding stick will sort of nibble off that little paper bead around the edge. Okay, so I've got my center rib pretty close to where I want it. I'm going to kind of come back in and eyeball it with my design and start to think through how that design is going to appear, how my other ribs are going to get progressively smaller. And I've got a few more ribs to design here. What I'll do most likely is just sort of lay this rib on top of another piece and trace this thing out so that I have kind of my beginning shape, and then modify it as I go. So I've worked a bit further on this project here. I've started to refine my initial sketches, right? My initial sketches were just me bending the wood and kind of getting a feel for what kind of shapes the wood can handle. And I'm just kind of working a little bit intuitively as I go here and modifying some of my shapes on the go. I started with my main center rib and started to redraw my form because I wanted to refine some of those lines, and then came over here to actually start getting a bit of a profile look. So this way I can sort of keep track of what my ribs are doing, and I can keep some of my sort of torsional distortions symmetrical by mimicking, just laying two pieces of foam core on top of each other and mimicking those lines, either cutting and even sanding them together. I also find that it's really helpful for me visually to kind of imagine where this project is going, to lay them out on my drawing and sort of look down the line to kind of imagine, you know, what the sort of bending of these stringers might look like over my ribs. If my ribs need modifying at this point, right, it's still pretty easy. I'm early in the stage, and so it's not that big of a deal if I have to kind of come back and take a little bit more off or shape some of these edges. I'm not looking for perfection. This is only my second version at this, so I'm just sort of trying to feel out what's possible, right? Now, I also find that once my ribs are looking about where I want them, I'm going to dress the edges of my ribs at sort of every step along the way. It's really hard to come back and fine-tune the edges of the foam core later on once it's done. And so if you dress the edges with a piece of 220 sandpaper, dressing them just means knocking any of the wood fibers off, and then maybe cleaning up the face, or I should say cleaning up this sort of edge face here, and that way when we cut our notches in the next tutorial, we'll have a nice sort of clean template to work with. Now, as you might be able to see, this makes a real mess, and so wherever you happen to be working at home, make sure that this is a place where you can kind of make a bit of a mess and not have to clean it up all the time. At school, don't worry, we'll take care of the kind of cleanup in between. I've got 2 more ribs to make, and I will catch up with you guys in the studio tomorrow and see where you're at with your designs.